Every woman knows the sting of feeling invisible in a room full of beauty. Every person has felt the weight of being overlooked, dismissed, or mocked for not fitting in. Freyja, the blacksmith's daughter, lived this reality every day in 9th century Norway. At the wedding feast, she watched from the shadows as nobles laughed at her plain dress and weathered hands. Then something impossible happened. Bjorn Stoneback, the most feared warrior in the land, stood up from the high table. He walked across the hall, past all the beautiful maidens, and stopped in front of her. With his massive, scarred hand extended, he spoke words that silenced the entire feast. But why would this giant choose her above all others? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great hall of Jarl Magnus stretched like a wooden cathedral beneath the flickering light of 100 torches. Carved dragon heads glared down from the massive support beams, their eyes seeming to follow the movements of the wedding guests below. The air hung thick with the scent of roasted boar, honeyed mead, and the sweet smoke of burning birchwood. Tonight, the hall celebrated the union of Astrid Magnusdottir, the Jarl's golden-haired daughter, to Eric Bloodaxe, a young warrior whose family controlled 3 prosperous fjords to the north. Freyja, Eric's daughter, pressed herself against the cold stone wall near the servants' entrance, her calloused fingers gripping a wooden cup of weak ale. At 26 winters, she had long passed the age when most women found husbands and bore children. Her father, Eric the smith, had brought her to serve at the feast, not as a guest, but as an extra pair of hands to help with the endless stream of platters and pitchers that flowed from kitchen to table. She wore her only decent dress, a simple brown wool garment that her mother had sewn years before her death. The fabric had been washed so many times it felt soft as lamb's skin, but its plainness stood in stark contrast to the rich silks and imported linens that adorned the noble women. Their jewelry caught the torchlight: silver arm rings, amber pendants, and intricate brooches that cost more than her father earned in a full season. Freyja's only adornment was a small iron pendant shaped like Thor's hammer, a gift from her father on her 16th birthday. The wedding couple sat at the high table on a raised platform, surrounded by the most important guests. Astrid glowed like a summer sunrise in her crimson wedding dress, embroidered with golden threads that formed intricate knotwork patterns. Her blonde hair had been braided with ribbons and small silver bells that chimed softly when she moved. Eric Bloodaxe, barely 22 and already bearing the scars of 3 successful raids, gazed at his new bride with obvious pride and desire. "Look at the blacksmith's daughter," whispered Solveig, wife of a prosperous trader, loud enough for half the hall to hear, skulking in the shadows like a thrall who's forgotten her place. Her companions giggled behind their hands, their eyes bright with cruel mirth. Freyja felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her gaze fixed on the rushes scattered across the floor. She had learned long ago that responding to such comments only brought more attention, more laughter, more shame. "Perhaps she thinks someone might mistake her for a guest," added Ragnhild, a young woman whose father owned vast herds of cattle in the eastern valleys. "Though I cannot imagine who would make such an error." The laughter spread like ripples on a pond, drawing more attention to Freyja's corner. She considered slipping away through the servant's door, but her father would be looking for her soon to help carry the heavy platters of meat back to the kitchen. Running away would only bring him shame, and he had endured enough whispers about his unmarried daughter. At the high table, completely removed from the cruel entertainment below, sat Bjorn Stoneback. Even seated, his massive frame dominated the space around him. His shoulders stretched as wide as a door frame, and his arms, crossed over his chest, showed the corded muscle of a man who had spent his life wielding sword and shield. A thick brown beard, streaked with premature grey, covered the lower half of his face, but it could not hide the network of scars that marked his left cheek and jaw, souvenirs from a berserker's axe during a raid on the Frankish coast. Bjorn's reputation had spread across every fjord and valley in Norway. Men spoke his name in hushed tones around their hearths, telling stories of his battles that grew more fantastic with each telling. He had earned his byname Stoneback, not for his size, though he stood a full head taller than most warriors, but for his legendary endurance. In the great battle at Stamford Bridge, he had fought for an entire day with a Saxon spear shaft protruding from his back, refusing to fall until every enemy lay dead at his feet. What made Bjorn truly fearsome, however, was not his strength but his silence. He spoke rarely, and when he did, men listened. He had never been heard to boast, never been seen to lose his temper, never shown fear in the face of any opponent. Some whispered that he was blessed by Odin himself, others that he was touched by the same madness that drove the berserkers. All agreed that crossing Bjorn Stoneback meant death. Tonight he sat as an honoured guest at Jarl Magnus's table, having arrived 3 days earlier with a ship full of tribute from his recent victories in Ireland. Golden torques, silver arm rings, and chests of foreign coins had been his gift to the wedding couple, a display of wealth that had impressed even the Jarl himself. Yet Bjorn seemed untouched by the festivities around him. While other guests laughed and drank and told increasingly outrageous stories, he sat in contemplative silence, his pale blue eyes observing everything with the patience of a hunter. "Tell us, Bjorn," called out Magnus, raising his silver goblet toward the warrior, "when will we hear news of your own wedding feast? Surely a man of your standing should have sons to carry on his name." The question drew attention from across the hall. Conversations quieted as guests turned to hear the famous warrior's response. Bjorn lifted his own cup, a simple horn rim with silver, and drank deeply before speaking. "When the right woman appears," he said simply, his deep voice carrying clearly through the sudden hush. "I will not settle for less than what my heart demands." "Spoken like a poet," laughed Eric Bloodaxe, emboldened by Mead and his new status as the Jarl's son-in-law. "But perhaps your heart demands too much. The eligible daughters of good families are not endless, and you are no longer a young man." A dangerous quiet settled over the high table. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, aware that questioning Bjorn's judgment was rarely wise. The warrior set down his drinking horn with deliberate care and fixed his pale eyes on the younger man. "My standards," Bjorn said with soft menace, "are my own concern." The Jarl quickly intervened, sensing the tension. Of course. A man of Bjorn's reputation can afford to be selective. Come now, let us toast to the happy couple, and speak no more of unmarried men." The moment passed as goblets were raised, and the wedding celebration resumed its cheerful noise. But Freyja had noticed something others missed. During the brief exchange, Bjorn's eyes had moved across the hall, scanning the assembled guests with the same careful attention he might give to a battlefield. For just an instant, his gaze had rested on her corner near the servants' entrance. Their eyes had met across the crowded hall, and she had seen something unexpected in his weathered face, not pity or amusement, but something that looked almost like recognition. As the evening progressed, the laughter grew louder and the insults more pointed. The noble women, encouraged by Mead and the safety of their numbers, made Freyja the target of increasingly cruel jokes. They commented on her rough hands, her simple dress, her unmarried state, and her father's lowly profession. Each barb drew fresh laughter from their audience, and Freyja felt herself shrinking further into the shadows. "Perhaps we should find her a husband among the thralls," suggested one woman, "though even they might have standards. Or maybe one of the pigs from the sty," added another. "They are at least useful for something." The laughter that followed this comment was particularly harsh, and Freyja felt tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. She had endured such treatment for years, but tonight it seemed especially cruel. Surrounded by celebration and joy, she felt like a dark stain on a bright tapestry. It was then that the impossible happened. Bjorn Stoneback stood up. The simple action commanded immediate attention. When a man of his reputation rose from his seat, others took notice. Conversations faltered as heads turned toward the high table. The warrior's massive frame cast long shadows in the torchlight as he surveyed the hall with those unsettling pale eyes. For a long moment he said nothing. The only sounds were the crackling of torches and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Even the servants paused in their work, sensing that something significant was about to occur. Then, without explanation or announcement, Bjorn began to walk. His boots struck the wooden floor with deliberate, measured steps that echoed through the suddenly quiet hall. He moved past the high table, past the benches filled with wealthy merchants and minor jarls, past the silk-clad daughters of noble families who watched him with barely concealed hope. He was walking toward the servants' corner, toward Freyja. With each step, the silence deepened. This was not the behavior expected from a man of Bjorn's standing. Warriors of his caliber did not leave the high table during a feast. They certainly did not approach serving girls in dark corners. The very impossibility of what they were witnessing left the guests speechless. Freyja felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the giant warrior approached. She pressed herself harder against the stone wall, wishing she could disappear entirely. What could this man possibly want with her? Had she somehow offended him? Was he about to publicly humiliate her for some imagined slight? Bjorn stopped directly in front of her, his massive frame blocking out most of the torchlight. Up close, he was even more intimidating than his reputation suggested. His shoulders were broad enough to fill a doorway, and his scarred hands looked capable of crushing stone. The network of battle scars on his face told the story of countless fights where lesser men had died. But when he looked down at her, Freyja saw something in his eyes that she had never expected to see from any man, let alone this legendary warrior. She saw respect. Slowly, carefully, as if approaching a frightened animal, Bjorn extended his right hand toward her. The hall held its collective breath, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the silence, reaching every corner of the great hall. "I choose you." The words hung in the air like a challenge to the gods themselves. Freyja stared at the extended hand, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The calloused palm facing upward bore the white lines of old sword cuts, and a thick scar ran across his knuckles where an enemy blade had found its mark years ago. This was the hand that had held weapons in a dozen battles, that had broken the shields of Saxon warriors and claimed treasure from Irish monasteries. And now it was reaching for her. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling torches. Bjorn's expression remained gentle but determined. "I choose you," he repeated, slightly louder this time, "to sit beside me at the high table, to share this feast as my companion." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the hall like wind through wheat. Noble women who had been mocking Freyja moments before now stared in disbelief. Men who had fought alongside Bjorn in distant lands leaned forward, certain they had misheard. Even Jarl Magnus half rose from his chair, his weathered face showing confusion and concern. "Bjorn," the Jarl called out carefully, "perhaps the mead has affected your judgment. The girl is—" "The girl," Bjorn interrupted without turning around, his voice carrying a warning edge, "is my choice for this evening. Do you question my right to choose my companion?" The challenge in his tone was unmistakable. In Norse culture, a man's honor was sacred, and his choices, particularly regarding women, were his own. To openly question such a decision was to invite conflict. Magnus settled back into his chair, though his expression remained troubled. Freyja's hands trembled as she looked around the hall. Every eye was upon her, some filled with shock, others with barely concealed fury. The noble women's faces had transformed from amused cruelty to something far more dangerous, wounded pride and jealous rage. "I cannot," she breathed, shaking her head. "I am not. I do not belong." "You belong wherever you choose to be," Bjorn said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "Tonight, I ask you to choose to sit beside me." The kindness in his words nearly broke her composure entirely. When was the last time anyone had spoken to her with such respect? When had anyone asked rather than commanded? Her father was gentle but worn down by years of struggle. Her mother had been dead for 8 winters. The world had taught her to expect nothing but cruelty from those above her station. Why? The question escaped her lips before she could stop it. For the first time, Bjorn's stern expression softened into something that might have been a smile. "Because you have endured their laughter with dignity, because you work without complaint to serve those who mock you, because strength comes in many forms, and yours has impressed me." His words struck her like lightning. He had been watching. He had seen how she carried herself through the constant humiliation, how she helped her father despite having no obligation to attend this feast, how she held her tongue when words would have only brought more pain. "The choice is yours," he said, his hand still extended. "But I would be honored by your company." Around them, the hall buzzed with whispered conversations. Freyja caught fragments of outraged commentary from the noble women, predictions of scandal from the men, and confused murmurs from the servants who had stopped their work to witness this unprecedented scene. Solveig's voice cut through the whispers like a blade. "This is madness. The girl is nobody, the daughter of a smith, with no breeding, no beauty, no dowry worthy of mention. She pollutes the high table by her very presence," added Ragnhild, her face flushed with wine and indignation. "What message does this send about our customs, our standards?" Their words stung, but something had changed in Freyja's heart during Bjorn's speech. The warrior had seen value in her that she had never recognized in herself. If a man legendary for his wisdom in battle and his careful judgment of character thought her worthy of honor, perhaps she had been wrong about her own worth. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Freyja reached out and placed her rough, work-worn hand in Bjorn's massive palm. His fingers closed gently around hers, and she felt the strength there, not crushing or dominating, but protective. He drew her forward with careful respect, allowing her to find her footing as they began the long walk across the hall toward the high table. The journey felt like crossing between worlds. With each step, Freyja left behind the shadows and servitude that had defined her life and moved towards something unimaginable. The rushes beneath her feet whispered secrets with every footfall, and the torchlight seemed to grow brighter as they approached the platform where the most powerful people in the region sat in stunned silence. She was acutely aware of her appearance, the simple brown dress that marked her as common-born, the calluses on her hands from helping at the forge, the way her hair hung loose without expensive ornaments or elaborate braiding. But Bjorn walked beside her with the same measured dignity he might show to a queen, his presence shielding her from the worst of the stares. As they reached the high table, Eric Bloodaxe leaned forward with obvious displeasure. "Friend Bjorn, surely you jest, to seat a serving girl among us." "I seat my chosen companion," Bjorn replied with quiet authority. "If you question my choice, you question my honor." The young warrior's face darkened, but he had neither the courage nor the standing to challenge Bjorn directly. He settled back with obvious frustration, while his new bride Astrid watched the proceedings with wide, fascinated eyes. Jarl Magnus gestured toward an empty chair that had been reserved for honored guests. "If this is your wish, Bjorn, then so be it, though I confess I do not understand." "Understanding is not required," Bjorn said as he guided Freyja to the chair. "Only respect for my decision." As Freyja settled into the carved wooden seat, the finest chair she had ever occupied, she felt the weight of 100 stairs. The high table was even more magnificent up close, laden with silver plates and goblets, exotic foods she had never tasted, and fine Norwegian steel knives with decorated handles. A servant immediately appeared with a silver goblet filled with the finest mead, the same quality served to jarls and wealthy merchants. The cup felt impossibly heavy in her hands, as if it were made of gold rather than silver. She had never held anything so valuable, never been served as if she were worthy of such consideration. Bjorn took his own seat beside her, his massive presence both protective and reassuring. "Have you eaten today?" he asked quietly. The simple question brought tears to her eyes. He cared about her comfort, her needs, her well-being. "Very little," she admitted. Without ceremony, he began placing the finest foods on her plate: roasted boar, glazed with honey, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, cheese aged in cool caves, and dried fruits imported from distant lands. Each item represented luxury beyond her normal experience. "Eat," he said gently. "You are my guest, and I would see you properly fed." As Freyja tasted flavors she had never experienced, she gradually became aware that the initial shock was wearing off and being replaced by something more dangerous. The noble women's whispered conversations had taken on a vicious edge. Men were openly questioning Bjorn's judgment, wondering if his legendary wisdom had finally failed him. But most disturbing was the way some guests looked at her, not with mere disapproval, but with genuine hatred. She had violated the natural order by accepting Bjorn's invitation, had risen above her station through no merit they could acknowledge. In their eyes, she had become something worse than a servant. She had become a threat. The silver goblet in her hands caught the torchlight, its polished surface reflecting the faces around the table. In that moment, Freyja realized that this night had changed everything. There would be no going back to her quiet life in the shadows, no return to invisibility and safety. Bjorn Stoneback had chosen her, and that choice would have consequences neither of them could yet foresee. The feast continued around them, but the atmosphere had shifted like the air before a thunderstorm. Conversations resumed, but they carried an undercurrent of tension that hadn't existed before Bjorn's unexpected choice. Freyja found herself caught between wonder at the rich food before her and anxiety about the hostile glances being cast in her direction. "Tell me about your work," Bjorn said, cutting through her worried thoughts. His voice was low enough that only she could hear, creating an island of privacy in the crowded hall. Freyja nearly choked on her mead. Nobody had ever asked her about her work, not as if it mattered, not as if she were a person worthy of interest. "My work? You help your father at the forge, do you not? I have heard he is skilled. He is the finest smith in 3 villages," she said with quiet pride, then immediately worried she had spoken too boldly. But Bjorn nodded with apparent interest. "What do you make?" "Tools, mostly. Hammers, axes for woodcutting, knives for the kitchen. Sometimes jewelry, simple pieces for weddings or naming ceremonies." She touched the iron Thor's hammer pendant at her throat. "My father taught me to work the smaller pieces, the delicate work." Bjorn's pale eyes fixed on the pendant. "You made that yourself?" "Yes," she whispered, suddenly self-conscious about the simple iron work compared to the elaborate silver and gold adorning the other women. "May I see it?" With trembling fingers, she lifted the pendant for his inspection. His massive hand moved with surprising gentleness as he examined the small hammer, turning it to catch the torchlight. The iron had been shaped with careful attention to detail, each line clean and purposeful, the surface polished to a soft gleam. "Beautiful work," he said, and she could tell he meant it. "The proportions are perfect, and see how the light catches here." He traced a fingertip along one edge. "That requires true skill." Heat flooded her cheeks at the compliment. She had always taken pride in her craft, but hearing praise from someone like Bjorn made her chest swell with unfamiliar emotion. "My Lady Astrid," called out a voice from further down the table, interrupting their quiet conversation. "Perhaps you could enlighten us about proper seating arrangements at noble feasts. I confess myself confused by tonight's innovations." The speaker was Ingrid Kjelsdottir, wife of a wealthy landowner and known for her sharp tongue. Her question was delivered with honeyed sweetness that fooled no one about its true intent. Astrid, the new bride, looked uncomfortable at being drawn into the brewing conflict. That is, my father's hall welcomes all whom our guests choose to honor," she said carefully. "Of course," Ingrid continued, her smile never wavering. "Though one wonders what message such flexibility sends about our traditions. Our ancestors built clear lines of rank and station for good reason." "Indeed," agreed Thorold Ironarm, a grizzled warrior who served as one of the Jarl's advisors. "When a blacksmith's daughter sits where Jarl's wives should be seated, what becomes of order, of respect for blood and breeding?" The criticism was aimed at Bjorn, but delivered indirectly, a calculated insult that allowed the speakers to voice their displeasure without directly challenging the famous warrior. Freyja felt her stomach clench with familiar shame and started to rise from her chair. Bjorn's hand settled gently but firmly on her arm, keeping her seated. "Thorold," he said, his voice carrying across the table with quiet authority, "I have seen you in battle. You are brave with a sword in your hand. Are you as brave with words when the person you speak of sits within earshot?" The older warrior's face flushed red. "I meant no disrespect to your companion." "Then perhaps you should consider your words more carefully," Bjorn suggested. The threat in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. An uncomfortable silence fell over their section of the table. Freyja realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to release it slowly. The warrior's protection felt like a shield around her, but she wondered how long it could last against the combined displeasure of so many powerful people. "Come," Bjorn said quietly, standing and offering his hand again. "Let us take some air." Grateful for any escape from the hostile atmosphere, Freyja accepted his help, rising from the ornate chair. As they moved toward a side door that led to the hall's garden, she heard the conversations resume behind them, but now the voices carried no pretense of politeness. The night air struck her face like a blessing after the stifling tension inside. The garden was simple but well tended, with herb beds and a few hardy flowers that bloomed despite the northern climate. A full moon cast silver light over everything, turning the ordinary plants into something magical. "I should not have accepted," Freyja said as soon as they were alone. "This was a mistake. I do not belong among such people." "You belong wherever your worth is recognized," Bjorn replied, but she shook her head. "You do not understand. Tomorrow, when you sail away to your next adventure, I will still be here. These people will remember this night, and they will make me pay for it." Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. When he spoke again, his voice held a note she hadn't heard before, something almost vulnerable. "What if I did not sail away?" The question caught her completely off guard. "What do you mean?" "I have spent 15 years fighting in distant lands, taking treasure from foreign shores, building a reputation that means nothing to me. I have gold enough to live comfortably, land enough to build a proper household." He paused, looking up at the moon. "But I have no one to share it with." Freyja's heart began to race. "You speak of..." "I speak of a woman who works with her hands to create beauty from iron, who endures insults with dignity, who cares more for her father's reputation than her own comfort." He turned to face her directly. "I speak of you." "That is impossible," she breathed. "Men like you do not choose women like me for such things. Men like me choose women who have something more valuable than beauty or noble blood," he said firmly. "They choose women with strength, with skill, with character that will not bend under pressure." Before she could respond, voices from the garden entrance made them both turn. 3 figures approached through the moonlight, Ingrid, her husband Kjell, and another man Freyja didn't recognize. Their faces were flushed with drink and anger. "So here you are," Ingrid called out, her earlier sweetness replaced by open hostility. "The great Bjorn Stoneback, reduced to skulking in gardens with serving wenches. "You go too far, woman," Bjorn warned, but Kjell stepped forward aggressively. "Do we? You dishonor this entire gathering with your behavior, seating a nobody at the high table, parading her around like she's worthy of respect." "She is worthy," Bjorn said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "more worthy than any of you." The third man, whom Freyja now recognized as Orm the Red, one of Kjell's warriors, laughed harshly. "Worthy of what? Of cleaning our boots? Of carrying slop to the pigs?" The insult hung in the air like a drawn blade. Freyja felt tears burning her eyes, but before she could flee, Bjorn moved. He didn't strike anyone. He simply stood to his full height and let the moonlight reveal the full extent of his intimidating presence. The scars on his face seemed darker in the silver light, and his pale eyes held the cold promise of violence. "Choose your next words very carefully," he said softly. "All of you." The confrontation might have erupted into violence if not for the timely arrival of Jarl Magnus himself. Drawn by raised voices and his instinct for preventing bloodshed at his daughter's wedding feast, the older man emerged from the hall with measured steps, his presence immediately cooling the heated atmosphere. "Friends," he said with the diplomatic tone that had kept peace in his lands for 20 years, "surely this celebration calls for joy, not conflict." Kjell and his companions stepped back, recognizing the authority in Magnus's voice, but their faces remained flushed with anger and humiliation. Bjorn slowly relaxed his intimidating posture, though his pale eyes never left the other men's faces. "Of course, my Jarl," Ingrid said with false sweetness, though her voice carried a tremor of barely controlled rage. "We were simply expressing our concern about certain departures from tradition." "Tradition?" Magnus repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, tradition is important, but so is hospitality to honored guests." His gaze moved meaningfully to Bjorn, "and respect for their choices." The message was clear, and the confrontation dissolved as quickly as it had formed. Kjell and his companions withdrew with muttered words and dark glances, while Ingrid offered a stiff curtsy before following them back toward the hall. When they were alone again with the Jarl, Magnus turned to study Freyja with curious eyes. She felt herself shrinking under his assessment, acutely aware of her simple dress and common birth. "You are Eric the Smith's daughter," he said finally. It was not a question. "Yes, my lord," she replied quietly. "Your father has served my household well. He repaired my sword when others said it could not be done, and his work on the hall's hinges has stood for 10 years without complaint." Magnus nodded approvingly. "Good hands run in your family, I see." He was looking at her iron pendant, which had caught his attention much as it had Bjorn's. Without thinking, Freyja found herself explaining, "My father taught me the smaller work, jewelry and decorative pieces." "May I?" the Jarl asked, gesturing toward the pendant. With nervous fingers, she lifted it for his examination. Like Bjorn before him, Magnus studied the craftsmanship with genuine interest, turning the small hammer to catch the moonlight on its polished surfaces. "Excellent proportions," he murmured. "The detail work here is particularly fine. How long did this take to complete?" 3 days, my lord, but that was because I reworked the design twice. I wanted it to be perfect." "Perfectionism in a craftsperson is admirable," Magnus said, releasing the pendant. "It speaks to character as much as skill." The Jarl's unexpected kindness made Freyja's eyes well with tears. After the cruelty she had endured from his other guests, his respectful treatment felt like a gift from the gods themselves. "However," Magnus continued, his tone becoming more serious, "I feel obligated to warn you both that tonight's events will have consequences. There are those among my guests who feel strongly about matters of rank and propriety." "Let them feel as they wish," Bjorn said firmly. "Their opinions do not govern my choices." "Perhaps not," the Jarl agreed, "but they may govern how those choices are received. Word of tonight will spread beyond these walls. Other Jarls, other noble families will hear of what happened here." Freyja felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She understood what Magnus was saying, that Bjorn's public elevation of her would be seen as an insult by powerful people throughout Norway. The warrior's reputation might protect him, but she would be vulnerable to their revenge. "I should withdraw my acceptance," she said quietly. "Return to my proper place before more damage is done." "No," Bjorn said immediately. "You will not retreat because small minds cannot see past their own prejudices." "But the Jarl is right," she insisted. "There will be consequences." "Then we will face them," Bjorn declared. "Together, if you will have me." The weight of his words settled over them like a cloak. He was offering more than protection. He was offering partnership, alliance, a future that seemed impossible given their different stations. Magnus cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps this conversation would be better continued tomorrow, when emotions have cooled and wine has cleared from everyone's heads. For tonight, I suggest we return to the feast and allow the celebration to continue as intended. They made their way back into the hall, where the atmosphere had indeed cooled somewhat. The confrontation in the garden seemed to have released some of the tension, and most guests had returned to their drinking and storytelling. However, Freyja noticed that several groups of women fell silent when she passed, their eyes following her with unconcealed hostility. Back at the high table, Bjorn resumed his seat and gestured for Freyja to join him. This time she accepted with less hesitation, though she remained acutely aware of the stares and whispers around them. "Tell me about your mother," Bjorn said quietly, once again creating their island of private conversation. The question surprised her. Most people avoided mentioning her mother's death, as if the topic might bring bad luck. "She died when I was 18 winters, a fever that the healers could not break. She taught you to work iron? She taught me many things. How to read the flames in the forge, how to judge when metal is ready to be worked, how to find beauty in simple materials." Freyja smiled at the memory. She said that anyone could make something functional, but it took an artist to make it beautiful as well. "Wise words," Bjorn observed. "She would be proud of what you have become." "Would she?" Freyja wondered aloud. "Sometimes I think she would have wanted me to marry young, to have children, to live a normal life, instead of remaining unmarried and working at my father's forge." "Perhaps," Bjorn said thoughtfully, "or perhaps she would understand that some people are meant for different paths than others expect." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a harp being tuned. One of the skalds was preparing to recite, and the hall was settling into the appreciative quiet that preceded a good story. Freyja found herself looking forward to the entertainment, hoping it would provide respite from the tension of the evening. But as the skald began his tale, a story of a warrior who chose love over duty, she realized that even the entertainment seemed to echo the choices being made around her. The parallels were too obvious to ignore, and she caught several meaningful glances directed toward their section of the table. Nothing tonight would be simple or innocent. Every word, every gesture, every choice was being weighed and judged by people who would remember long after the feast ended. 3 days passed after the wedding feast, and the repercussions rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Freyja had returned to her father's forge, expecting to resume her quiet life, but the normalcy she craved proved elusive. Word of Bjorn's unprecedented choice had spread through the village and beyond, carried by guests who had witnessed the extraordinary scene. The morning after the feast, she had awakened to find her father sitting by their small hearth, his weathered face creased with worry. Eric the smith was a man of few words, but his concern spoke volumes as he studied his daughter across their modest dwelling. "The baker's wife came by yesterday evening," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "She heard interesting tales from the wedding feast." Freyja felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Father, I can explain." "You need explain nothing to me," Eric interrupted gently. "But others may not be so understanding." Gunnar Ironfist stopped by the forge as well. He had questions about our family's ambitions. The name made Freyja's blood chill. Gunnar was one of Jarl Magnus's enforcers, a man known for his brutality and his loyalty to the established order. If he was asking questions about their family, it meant the noble guests had complained about the wedding incident. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "The truth, that you are my daughter, that you work hard, that you have never reached beyond your station." Eric's eyes finally met hers. "But I fear that may not be enough if certain people decide we have become troublesome." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. In their world, a blacksmith's family survived by the grace of their betters. If the nobles decided Eric the smith and his daughter were a threat to the social order, they could destroy their livelihood with a word. "Perhaps I should leave," Freyja said quietly. "Travel to another village where this story has not spread, start fresh somewhere else, and abandon your life here. Your home." Eric shook his head firmly. "We are not the ones who have done wrong, daughter. You accepted an invitation given in good faith. If others choose to see evil in that, the fault lies with them." But even as her father spoke brave words, Freyja could see the fear in his eyes. He was nearly 50 winters old, too ancient to start over in a new place, too set in his ways to learn different customs. This forge, this village, these people, they were his entire world. A knock at their door interrupted her dark thoughts. Through the gaps in the wooden planks, she could see a massive silhouette that made her heart skip. Eric rose to open the door, revealing Bjorn Stoneback in the morning light. The warrior looked different away from the formal setting of the Jarl's Hall. He wore simple travelling clothes, wool and leather, suited for long journeys, but his presence still commanded immediate respect. Eric stepped back with a respectful bow, gesturing for the famous warrior to enter their humble home. "Eric the smith," Bjorn said with genuine warmth, "I have come to commission some work, if you are willing." "Of course, my lord," Eric replied, though his voice carried a note of confusion. "Though I confess surprise. Surely a man of your standing has access to the finest smiths in all Norway." "I do," Bjorn agreed, his pale eyes moving to Freyja. "But I prefer to work with craftsmen I trust. I have need of something special, a piece that requires both skill and artistry." From a leather pouch at his belt, he withdrew an object that made both father and daughter gasp. It was an arm ring of pure silver, but not just any arm ring. The metal had been twisted into intricate patterns that caught the light like flowing water, and the craftsmanship spoke of royal workshops and master artisans. "This belonged to a Saxon king," Bjorn explained, setting the precious object on their rough wooden table. "I claimed it in battle 3 years ago, but it has never felt right on my arm. The patterns are foreign, the weight unfamiliar. I would like it melted down and reformed into something more suitable to my taste." Eric approached the arm ring with reverent hands, his craftsman's eye immediately assessing the work. "My lord, this is worth more than I earn in 5 years. The silver alone will serve its purpose better as something I will actually wear," Bjorn finished. "I trust your skill to preserve its value while improving its form." Freyja understood immediately what was happening. This was not really about remaking jewelry, it was about providing her father with valuable work that would demonstrate continued noble patronage. If Eric the smith was trusted with such precious materials by Bjorn Stoneback himself, other potential customers would hesitate before taking their business elsewhere. "What design did you have in mind?" Eric asked, though his hands already moved with the certainty of a master planning his approach. "Something Norse," Bjorn replied, "something that honors our traditions while displaying the beauty of the silver." Perhaps my companion could offer suggestions. I noticed her eye for design at the feast. The request was delivered casually, but Freyja felt its significance. He was asking for her artistic input, treating her as a partner in the creative process rather than a servant following orders. If my father agrees," she said hesitantly. "Your daughter's work is skilled," Eric said with quiet pride. "Her eye for proportion is better than mine, and her hand with detail work surpasses most smiths twice her age." "Then, perhaps, she could create preliminary sketches," Bjorn suggested. designs that honor both the value of the silver and the preferences of its future wearer. As they discussed the technical aspects of the project, the melting process, the forming techniques, the time required for proper execution, Freyja found herself drawn into the conversation as an equal participant. Bjorn asked her opinion about patterns, listened carefully to her suggestions about structural elements, and treated her expertise with the same respect he showed her father. The morning passed quickly as they planned the ambitious project. When Bjorn finally prepared to leave, he had established not just a commission, but an ongoing relationship that would keep the family financially secure for months to come. "I will return in a few days to check on your progress," he announced, "and perhaps to invite you both to share a meal at the inn. I find myself curious about other pieces you have created." After he left, father and daughter sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Finally, Eric spoke, his voice filled with wonder and concern in equal measure. "That man is either the greatest blessing or the greatest danger our family has ever encountered," he said quietly. "Perhaps both." Freyja touched her iron pendant, thinking about the events of the past few days. Her quiet life had been shattered beyond repair, but in its place, something new was emerging, frightening and wonderful in equal measure. Outside their small window, she could see neighbors gathering in small groups, their heads bent in urgent conversation. The story was still spreading, still growing, still changing with each telling. Soon, everyone in 3 villages would know that Bjorn Stoneback had chosen the blacksmith's daughter, and that choice would reshape her world in ways she could not yet imagine. A week into their work on the silver arm ring, Freyja discovered that transformation could be as dangerous as it was beautiful. The project had consumed her days and invaded her dreams, each sketch bringing her deeper into the intricate challenge of honoring both Norse tradition and Bjorn's personal taste. The Saxon silver had been melted down and reformed into preliminary shapes, but the final design remained elusive. She was hunched over her sketching tablet, charcoal smudging her fingers as she refined the knotwork patterns, when raised voices outside made her look up. Through the forge's open doorway, she could see a group of women approaching Ingrid, Solveig, and several others from the wedding feast. Their expressions promised trouble. "Father," she called quietly, but Eric was deep in the forge room, his attention focused on maintaining the precise temperature needed for their delicate work. The sound of hammer on anvil would mask any conversation at the front of their workshop. Ingrid entered without invitation, her rich dress a stark contrast to the soot and iron shavings that covered every surface. Behind her, the other women crowded into the small space, their perfumed presence overwhelming the familiar scents of coal, smoke, and hot metal. "So here is where the great seductress works," Ingrid said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How charming, how perfectly rustic." Freyja set down her charcoal and rose from her stool, acutely aware of her soot-stained apron and work-roughened hands. "My ladies, how may I serve you?" "Serve us," Solveig laughed harshly. "You have already served us quite enough, girl. Your little performance at the wedding has set tongues wagging from here to Bergen." "I did nothing but accept an invitation," Freyja said quietly, though her heart was racing. "You accepted far more than an invitation," Ragnhild interjected, moving closer. "You accepted a place that was never meant for you, and now you parade that acceptance like a banner of conquest." The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Since the feast, she had indeed felt different, more confident, more aware of her own worth. Bjorn's respect had opened her eyes to possibilities she had never dared consider. "I have claimed nothing that was not freely offered," she replied, trying to match their calm tone despite her growing fear. "Freely offered?" Ingrid stepped forward until she stood uncomfortably close. "Do you truly believe that a man like Bjorn Stoneback would choose a creature like you for anything but sport? You are a diversion, girl, a novelty to amuse him until he tires of playing at being common." The words hit like physical blows, awakening every insecurity Freyja had ever harbored about her appearance, her station, her worth. But alongside the pain came a flicker of anger, not just at the cruelty of the words, but at their presumption. "You speak as if you know his mind," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Have you asked him about his intentions?" "We do not need to ask," Solveig replied with vicious certainty. "We know men like Bjorn. They take their pleasure where they find it, then return to their own kind when the game grows stale." "Is that what your husbands told you when they chose you?" Freyja asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. "That you were their equals, worthy of respect and partnership, or did they simply settle for what was expected?" The silence that followed was electric with fury. Ingrid's face had gone white with rage, while the other women looked as if they had been slapped. None of them had expected the blacksmith's daughter to fight back with words. "How dare you?" Ingrid breathed. "How dare you speak to your betters with such insolence?" "My betters?" Freyja found strength flowing through her that she had never known she possessed. "You mock me for my birth and my appearance, yet what have any of you created with your own hands? What skills do you possess beyond looking beautiful at feasts and producing heirs for men who chose you for your dowries?" "Enough!" Ragnhild snarled, raising her hand as if to strike. "I would not," said a deep voice from the doorway. Every head turned to see Bjorn filling the entrance, his massive frame blocking most of the light. Behind him stood Eric, his face creased with worry and confusion. "My lord Bjorn," Ingrid recovered quickly, smoothing her expression into something resembling courtesy. "How fortunate. We were just—" "I heard what you were doing," Bjorn said quietly, stepping into the workshop. His pale eyes moved from woman to woman, cataloguing their positions, their expressions, their obvious guilt. "I heard every word spoken in the last several minutes." The threat in his tone was unmistakable. These women had been caught in the act of intimidation, and they knew it. "We meant no harm," Solveig said quickly. "We were simply concerned about certain improprieties." "The only impropriety I see," Bjorn interrupted, "is noble women entering a craftsman's workshop uninvited and insulting his daughter in her own home." His words carried the weight of law. In Norse society, a man's home was sacred, and uninvited intrusion could be seen as a declaration of hostility. "You misunderstand," Ingrid tried desperately. "We came merely to leave," Bjorn finished firmly. "Now, all of you." The women filed out with what dignity they could muster, but their defeat was obvious. As they passed Bjorn in the doorway, each avoided meeting his eyes. Only Ingrid dared to speak as she departed. "This will not be forgotten," she said quietly, her words meant for Freyja. "Neither will your behavior here today," Bjorn replied, and Ingrid's face went pale as she hurried after her companions. When they were alone again, Eric retreated to his forge with obvious relief, leaving Freyja and Bjorn to face each other across the cluttered workspace. The sketches of the arm ring lay scattered where they had been disturbed during the confrontation. "Are you harmed?" Bjorn asked gently. Freyja shook her head, though her hands were trembling slightly. "They spoke only words, but their words they said things that made me wonder." "Wonder what?" She met his eyes directly, needing to see his face when he answered, "Whether you see me as they described, a diversion, a novelty to amuse you until you grow tired of the game." Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, considering his response with the care he might give to planning a battle strategy. When he spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "I have traveled to every kingdom in the known world. I have seen the most beautiful women in Byzantium, the cleverest in Baghdad, the most refined in Paris. I have been offered marriage alliances with princesses and jarlers' daughters whose dowries could buy small kingdoms." He paused, gathering her charcoal-stained hands in his massive palms. "None of them interested me enough to consider changing my life. And I do. You make me want to build something instead of just taking from others." You make me imagine a home instead of just a place to store treasure. You make me think about tomorrow instead of living only for today." His scarred thumbs traced gently over her knuckles. "If that is a game, it is one I never want to end." The revelation came 3 days later, carried by a travel-worn messenger who arrived at the village just as the morning mist was lifting from the fjord. Word spread quickly through the settlement. King Harald Hardrada was dead, killed in battle at Stamford Bridge, and his death had plunged Norway into chaos. Freyja first learned of the news when her father burst into their home, his face ashen with shock and fear. Behind him came Bjorn, his expression grim as death itself. "The king is dead," Eric announced without preamble. "Slain by Saxon arrows in England." The words hit Freyja like a physical blow. King Harald had ruled Norway for her entire adult life, his iron will holding together the fractious jarls and petty kings who constantly schemed for power. Without his authority, the delicate balance that maintained peace would crumble. "What does this mean for us?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Civil war," Bjorn said quietly. "Magnus the Good has the strongest claim to the throne, but Sweyn Estridsson will press his own case, and at least 3 jarls have armies large enough to make trouble." Eric sank into his chair by the fire, suddenly looking every one of his 50 winters. "And when jarls fight jarls, common folk suffer." But Freyja was studying Bjorn's face, reading the tension in his jaw, the way his pale eyes stared into the distance. There was something he wasn't telling them, some additional complication that made this news even worse than it appeared. "There is more," she said. It wasn't a question. Bjorn met her gaze, and she saw confirmation of her fears in his expression. "Magnus the Good has summoned all sworn warriors to his banner. He expects to face challenges to his claim within the month." The implication struck her immediately. Bjorn was one of Norway's most famous warriors, his reputation and skill making him valuable to any claimant who could secure his loyalty. He would be expected to choose a side and fight for it. "You must go," Eric said heavily. "A man of your standing cannot ignore such a summons without being branded a traitor." "Perhaps," Bjorn replied, but his tone suggested he was considering alternatives that others might not. "There is no perhaps about it," Eric insisted. "To ignore a royal summons is to invite destruction not just upon yourself, but upon anyone associated with you." The weight of those words settled over the small room like a shroud. If Bjorn defied the summons and remained in the village, his presence would bring royal wrath down upon everyone who had shown him hospitality. The village itself could be burned, its people scattered or enslaved. "How long do you have?" Freyja asked quietly. "The messenger," said Magnus, "expects all sworn men to present themselves within a fortnight. That gives me perhaps 10 days to decide my course." 10 days. The number hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. In 10 days, everything they had been building together would end, swept away by forces larger than their personal desires. "There is another complication," Bjorn continued, his voice growing even grimmer. "The messenger brought word that several jarls have already begun choosing sides. Jarl Magnus has declared for Magnus the Good, but there are others." He paused, clearly reluctant to continue, which filled Freyja with cold dread. "Others what?" she prompted. "Others who see this period of uncertainty as an opportunity to settle old grievances. Kell, Iron Tooth and his allies have been spreading word that the social order is crumbling, that common folk are growing too bold, that examples must be made." Eric's face went pale. "Examples? Your family has drawn attention because of my choices at the wedding feast. In normal times, that attention might have remained mere gossip, but if war comes, if local jarls need scapegoats to blame for the kingdom's troubles," he didn't need to finish. Freyja understood perfectly. In times of chaos, the powerful always looked for someone weaker to blame for their problems. A blacksmith's daughter who had dared to sit at the high table made a perfect target for those who wanted to demonstrate that the old hierarchies still held power. So we have enemies who will use the king's death as an excuse to destroy us, she said, surprising herself with how calmly she could discuss her own potential doom. And you have obligations that will take you far from here, leaving us defenseless. That is one way to see the situation, Bjorn agreed. What is another way? For the first time since entering their home, Bjorn's expression lightened slightly. We could refuse to accept that those are our only choices. Eric leaned forward in his chair. What do you mean? I mean that sworn service to a dead king does not automatically transfer to his successor. Magnus the Good may expect my loyalty, but he has not earned it. I am under no legal obligation to answer his summons. But the consequences, Eric began, would be severe if I remained here, Bjorn finished. But there are other places in the world where a skilled warrior can make his way. The suggestion hung in the air like an impossible dream. Freyja felt her heart racing as she began to understand what he was proposing. You would leave Norway? She asked. I would take my household to a place where my past service means less than my present skills. Ireland, perhaps, or the Frankish lands, even Byzantium, where the emperor always has need of experienced warriors. Your household? Eric repeated carefully. My wife, Bjorn said, looking directly at Freyja. Her father, who is the finest smith I have ever known. Anyone else who chooses to join us in building something new rather than defending something that is already dying. The proposal was so audacious, so completely contrary to everything Freyja had been taught about duty and place and proper behavior that she could barely process it. Leave Norway? Leave everything she had ever known to travel to foreign lands with a man she had known for barely 2 weeks? You speak of marriage, Eric said slowly, but such things require time, proper negotiations, bride price. In normal times, Bjorn agreed, but these are not normal times. If we are to act, we must act quickly. A ship can be ready within 3 days. We could be beyond Norwegian waters before anyone realizes we have gone. This is madness, Eric protested, though his voice lacked conviction. To abandon our home, our life, everything we know. To save our lives, Bjorn corrected, and to build something better than what we leave behind. Freyja stood and walked to their small window, looking out at the village where she had spent her entire life. She could see the baker's shop, where cruel gossip was traded like currency, the well where women gathered to whisper about their neighbors' failings, the paths she had walked while enduring decades of mockery and dismissal. What would we do in these foreign lands? She asked without turning around. What we do here, Bjorn replied. I would serve whoever pays me fairly. Your father would practice his craft. You would continue creating beauty from iron and silver. And if we were unhappy? If we regretted leaving everything behind? Then we would be unhappy in a place where no one can punish us for choosing love over duty. The word struck her like lightning. Love. He had not spoken the word directly before, had not named what was growing between them with such clear certainty. She turned to face him, seeing in his scarred features a future she had never dared imagine, dangerous and uncertain, but free from the constraints that had defined her entire life. When would we need to decide? She asked. Tonight, Bjorn said. The ship I have in mind sails with the morning tide in 3 days. If we are to book passage, arrangements must be made immediately. 3 days. Not 10, not a fortnight, but 3 days to decide whether to abandon everything she had ever known for the chance at something unprecedented. Outside their window, she could see smoke rising from the forge where she had learned her craft, where her mother had taught her to find beauty in simple materials. The familiar sight should have filled her with warmth, but instead she felt only the weight of limitations, the suffocating certainty of a life lived entirely within bounds set by others. One question, she said finally. If I choose to come with you, will it be as your wife in truth, or as a convenient companion for your travels? Bjorn crossed the room and took her hands in his his scarred palms warm against her work-roughened skin. "As my partner in all things," he said solemnly, "my wife, my equal, my companion, in whatever adventures await us beyond these shores." The promise was everything she had never dared hope for, everything she had been told she could never have. The revelation came 3 days later, carried by a travel-worn messenger who arrived at the village just as the morning mist was lifting from the fjord. Word spread quickly through the settlement. King Harald Hardrada was dead, killed in battle at Stamford Bridge, and his death had plunged Norway into chaos. Freyja first learned of the news when her father burst into their home, his face ashen with shock and fear. Behind him came Bjorn, his expression grim as death itself. "The king is dead," Eric announced without preamble, "slain by Saxon arrows in England." The words hit Freyja like a physical blow. King Harald had ruled Norway for her entire adult life, his iron will holding together the fractious jarls and petty kings who constantly schemed for power. Without his authority, the delicate balance that maintained peace would crumble. "What does this mean for us?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Civil war," Bjorn said quietly. "Magnus the Good has the strongest claim to the throne, but Sweyn Estridsson will press his own case, and at least 3 jarls have armies large enough to make trouble." Eric sank into his chair by the fire, suddenly looking every one of his 50 winters. And when jarls fight jarls, common folk suffer. But Freyja was studying Bjorn's face, reading the tension in his jaw, the way his pale eyes stared into the distance. There was something he wasn't telling them, some additional complication that made this news even worse than it appeared. "There is more," she said. It wasn't a question. Bjorn met her gaze, and she saw confirmation of her fears in his expression. "Magnus the Good has summoned all sworn warriors to his banner. He expects to face challenges to his claim within the month." The implication struck her immediately. Bjorn was one of Norway's most famous warriors, his reputation and skill making him valuable to any claimant who could secure his loyalty. He would be expected to choose a side and fight for it. "You must go," Eric said heavily. "A man of your standing cannot ignore such a summons without being branded a traitor." "Perhaps," Bjorn replied, but his tone suggested he was considering alternatives that others might not. "There is no perhaps about it," Eric insisted. "To ignore a royal summons is to invite destruction not just upon yourself, but upon anyone associated with you." The weight of those words settled over the small room like a shroud. If Bjorn defied the summons and remained in the village, his presence would bring royal wrath down upon everyone who had shown him hospitality. The village itself could be burned, its people scattered or enslaved. "How long do you have?" Freyja asked quietly. The messenger said Magnus expects all sworn men to present themselves within a fortnight. "That gives me perhaps 10 days to decide my course." 10 days. The number hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. In 10 days, everything they had been building together would end, swept away by forces larger than their personal desires. "There is another complication," Bjorn continued, his voice growing even grimmer. "The messenger brought word that several jarls have already begun choosing sides. Jarl Magnus has declared for Magnus the Good, but there are others." He paused, clearly reluctant to continue, which filled Freyja with cold dread. "Others, what?" she prompted. "Others who see this period of uncertainty as an opportunity to settle old grievances. Kjell Iron-Tooth and his allies have been spreading word that the social order is crumbling, that common folk are growing too bold, that examples must be made." Eric's face went pale. "Examples? Your family has drawn attention because of my choices at the wedding feast. In normal times, that attention might have remained mere gossip, but if war comes, if local jarls need scapegoats to blame for the kingdom's troubles." He didn't need to finish. Freyja understood perfectly. In times of chaos, the powerful always looked for someone weaker to blame for their problems. A blacksmith's daughter who had dared to sit at the high table made a perfect target for those who wanted to demonstrate that the old hierarchies still held power. "So we have enemies who will use the king's death as an excuse to destroy us," she said, surprising herself with how calmly she could discuss her own potential doom. "And you have obligations that will take you far from here, leaving us defenseless." "That is one way to see the situation," Bjorn agreed. "What is another way?" For the first time since entering their home, Bjorn's expression lightened slightly. "We could refuse to accept that those are our only choices." Eric leaned forward in his chair. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sworn service to a dead king does not automatically transfer to his successor. Magnus the Good may expect my loyalty, but he has not earned it. I am under no legal obligation to answer his summons. But the consequences," Eric began, "would be severe if I remained here," Bjorn finished. "But there are other places in the world where a skilled warrior can make his way." The suggestion hung in the air like an impossible dream. Freyja felt her heart racing as she began to understand what he was proposing. "You would leave Norway?" she asked. "I would take my household to a place where my past service means less than my present skills. Ireland, perhaps, or the Frankish lands. Even Byzantium, where the emperor always has need of experienced warriors." "Your household?" Eric repeated carefully. "My wife," Bjorn said, looking directly at Freyja. "Her father, who is the finest smith I have ever known. Anyone else who chooses to join us in building something new, rather than defending something that is already dying." The proposal was so audacious, so completely contrary to everything Freyja had been taught about duty and place and proper behavior, that she could barely process it. Leave Norway? Leave everything she had ever known to travel to foreign lands with a man she had known for barely 2 weeks? "You speak of marriage," Eric said slowly, "but such things require time, proper negotiations, bride price." "In normal times," Bjorn agreed. "But these are not normal times. If we are to act, we must act quickly. A ship can be ready within 3 days. We could be beyond Norwegian waters before anyone realizes we have gone." "This is madness," Eric protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "To abandon our home, our life, everything we know. To save our lives," Bjorn corrected, "and to build something better than what we leave behind." Freyja stood and walked to their small window, looking out at the village where she had spent her entire life. She could see the baker's shop, where cruel gossip was traded like currency, the well where women gathered to whisper about their neighbors' failings, the paths she had walked while enduring decades of mockery and dismissal. "What would we do in these foreign lands?" she asked, without turning around. "What we do here," Bjorn replied. "I would serve whoever pays me fairly. Your father would practice his craft. You would continue creating beauty from iron and silver. And if we were unhappy, if we regretted leaving everything behind, then we would be unhappy in a place where no one can punish us for choosing love over duty." The words struck her like lightning. Love. He had not spoken the word directly before, had not named what was growing between them with such clear certainty. She turned to face him, seeing in his scarred features a future she had never dared imagine, dangerous and uncertain, but free from the constraints that had defined her entire life. "When would we need to decide?" she asked. "Tonight," Bjorn said. "The ship I have in mind sails with the morning tide in 3 days. If we are to book passage, arrangements must be made immediately. 3 days. Not 10, not a fortnight, but 3 days to decide whether to abandon everything she had ever known for the chance at something unprecedented." Outside their window, she could see smoke rising from the forge where she had learned her craft, where her mother had taught her to find beauty in simple materials. The familiar sight should have filled her with warmth, but instead she felt only the weight of limitations, the suffocating certainty of a life lived entirely within bounds set by others. "One question," she said finally. "If I choose to come with you, will it be as your wife in truth, or as a convenient companion for your travels?" Bjorn crossed the room and took her hands in his scarred palms warm against her work-roughened skin. "As my partner in all things," he said solemnly, "my wife, my equal, my companion in whatever adventures await us beyond these shores." The promise was everything she had never dared hope for, everything she had been told she could never have. The confrontation that followed would be remembered in the village for generations, though few who witnessed it would ever speak of it openly. In the flickering torchlight, two forces faced each other across a line that divided not just the night, but two different visions of how the world should work. On one side stood Gunnar Iron Fist and 8 armed men, representatives of the old order where power flowed downward from jarl to noble to commoner, where questioning one's betters was tantamount to treason. They wore mail and carried weapons worth more than most families earned in a year, confident in their numbers and their assumed authority. On the other side stood Bjorn Stoneback, alone in the moonlight, but radiating the calm certainty of a man who had faced death so many times that it held no terror for him. His sword remained sheathed, his massive hands empty, but his presence seemed to fill the space between the opposing forces. 9 against 1, Bjorn observed, with something that might have been amusement. "Those seem like poor odds for you." Gunnar's face flushed with anger at the implied insult. "You always were too arrogant for your own good, Stoneback. Tonight you learn the price of standing with the wrong people." "The wrong people?" Bjorn's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "You mean a master craftsman and his daughter who have harmed no one, stolen nothing, threatened nobody? Those are the wrong people? They have forgotten their place," one of Gunnar's men snarled. "The girl thinks herself worthy to sit with nobles, and you encourage her delusions." "I see," Bjorn said thoughtfully. "So this is really about ensuring that everyone knows their proper station. That blacksmith's daughters remain invisible, that warriors choose only from approved bloodlines, that nothing ever changes from how it has always been." "Exactly," Gunnar declared, apparently missing the dangerous edge that had entered Bjorn's voice. "Then perhaps," Bjorn said, his hand finally moving to his sword hilt, "you should consider what station you hold compared to mine." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. In the rigid hierarchy that Gunnar claimed to defend, Bjorn's reputation placed him far above a mere enforcer like Iron Fist. If rank and station truly mattered, then Gunnar was the one stepping above his place. "Your reputation will not protect you against 9 blades," Gunnar warned, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Perhaps not," Bjorn agreed. "But consider this. If you kill me here tonight, what story will you tell? That the famous Bjorn Stoneback died defending a blacksmith's family from unlawful attack, that 9 armed men were needed to overcome 1 warrior protecting innocence. The psychological warfare was masterful. Bjorn was forcing Gunnar to think beyond the immediate confrontation to its aftermath. Even if they succeeded in killing him, the political consequences could be devastating. A man of Bjorn's reputation being murdered while defending helpless civilians would create a scandal that could reach the ears of jarls and kings. "We are not murderers," Gunnar protested. "We came only to search for stolen property." "Then show me the written warrant," Bjorn demanded. "Produce the legal document that authorizes this search, or admit that you are here unlawfully." Inside their home, Freyja pressed her ear to a gap in the wooden planks, straining to hear every word of the exchange. Her father stood behind her, hammer in hand, prepared to fight if their door was breached. But she could sense that the real battle was being fought with words, not weapons. "We need no warrant to investigate credible accusations," Gunnar declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "Credible?" Bjorn's laugh was cold as winter steel. "Kjell Irontooth accuses a man known for his honesty throughout 3 villages of theft, and you call this credible? What has Eric the Smith supposedly stolen?" The question hung in the air unanswered because Freyja realized her enemies had never bothered to invent specific charges. They had assumed that the mere accusation would be enough to justify their actions. That is not your concern, Gunnar finally replied. Everything about this situation is my concern, Bjorn shot back. This family is under my protection, and I will know exactly what crimes they are accused of committing. Your protection? One of the other men laughed harshly. What protection can you offer when you will be dead within the hour? The words were barely out of his mouth when Bjorn moved. Not to draw his sword, but to step forward a single measured pace that brought him close enough to touch the man who had spoken. The warrior's massive frame seemed to expand in the torchlight, and his pale eyes fixed on his target with predatory intensity. "Speak those words again," he said quietly. "Please." The man's courage evaporated like morning mist. Under Bjorn's direct gaze, he seemed to shrink, suddenly aware that he had threatened one of the most dangerous warriors in Norway. I meant no." "Yes, you did," Bjorn interrupted. "You meant exactly what you said. You came here tonight planning murder, and you were foolish enough to admit it in front of witnesses." He raised his voice slightly, ensuring his words would carry to the homes surrounding the forge. "Let everyone hear this clearly. These men came not to arrest criminals or recover stolen property, but to commit murder under cover of darkness." Shutters cracked open in nearby windows as villagers peered out to witness the unprecedented confrontation. The last thing Gunnar wanted was an audience for what he had planned to be a quiet elimination of troublemakers. "This ends now," Gunnar declared, his hand moving to his sword. "Stand aside, Stoneback, or die with them." Bjorn's response was to finally draw his own blade. The ring of steel being drawn from sheaths echoed through the night like the tolling of a funeral bell. 9 blades caught the torchlight, their edges gleaming with deadly promise, but it was Bjorn's single sword that commanded attention. The weapon was a masterwork of the smith's art, perfectly balanced, its steel folded and refolded until the metal held the strength of a dozen ordinary blades. "Last chance," Gunnar called out, though his voice betrayed the uncertainty he felt facing the legendary warrior. "Stand aside and live." "First chance," Bjorn corrected quietly, "for you to leave this place and never return. Choose wisely." The standoff stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours. Around them, the village held its collective breath as neighbors watched from darkened windows, witnessing a moment that would define their community's future. Would they be a place where might made right, where the powerful could crush the innocent without consequence? Or would they be something better? It was one of Gunnar's men who broke first, lunging forward with a wild swing aimed at Bjorn's head. The attack was poorly planned and telegraphed, the movement of an angry man rather than a skilled warrior. Bjorn simply wasn't there when the blade completed its arc. He moved with the fluid grace of water flowing around stone, his massive frame displaying a speed that seemed impossible for someone his size. His own sword swept up in a precise counter-attack that opened his attacker from hip to shoulder. The man dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering uselessly on the packed earth. 8, Bjorn said conversationally, as if commenting on the weather. The casual dismissal of their companion's death enraged the remaining attackers. They came at him in a rush, abandoning any pretense of coordination for the simple fury of overwhelming numbers. It was exactly the wrong approach against a warrior of Bjorn's experience. He met their charge not by retreating, but by advancing into it. His sword became a silver blur in the moonlight, deflecting one blade while opening the throat of its wielder, spinning to parry another attack while his pommel crushed the skull of a third opponent. In moments, the night air filled with the sounds of combat, steel ringing against steel, the wet impact of blade meeting flesh, the desperate gasps of dying men. But this was not the wild berserker fury of legend. Every movement was calculated, every strike precise. Bjorn fought like the master tactician he was, using his opponent's aggression against them, turning their numbers into a liability as they got in each other's way in their eagerness to reach him. Within the forge, Freyja pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle a cry as she witnessed the terrible efficiency of Bjorn's slaughter. She had heard stories of his prowess in battle, but seeing it firsthand was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. This gentle man, who had praised her craftsmanship and spoken of partnership, was also a killing machine without equal. 5, Bjorn announced, stepping over another fallen body. Gunnar Ironfist found himself backing away despite his intentions, his remaining men clustering around him in desperate defense. Half their force lay dead or dying in the space of moments, and their leader's confidence had evaporated like smoke. "This is madness," one of the survivors gasped. "He's not human, no man moves like that." "He bleeds like any man," Gunnar snarled, though his own voice shook with fear. "Surround him, don't let him." His words were cut short as Bjorn's charge scattered their formation like leaves before a storm. The warrior's blade traced deadly arcs through the night, finding gaps in armor with surgical precision. Another man fell, then another, until only Gunnar and 2 companions remained standing. "Yield!" Bjorn commanded, his sword point hovering inches from Gunnar's throat. "You have lost. Accept defeat and live." For a moment, it seemed the bloodshed might end. Gunnar's surviving companions had thrown down their weapons, recognizing the futility of continued resistance. But pride and fear warred in their leader's eyes, pride that wouldn't let him admit defeat, fear that surrender might mean execution anyway. "I will not yield to a traitor who abandons his sworn duty," Gunnar spat. "Then you will die for your stubbornness," Bjorn replied sadly. The final exchange lasted only seconds. Gunnar's desperate attack was met by a parry that sent his blade spinning from numb fingers, followed by a thrust that pierced his heart with merciful efficiency. He fell to his knees, then toppled forward, his blood pooling in the dust at Bjorn's feet. The silence that followed was absolute. 7 men lay dead in the space where the confrontation had begun, their weapons scattered and their blood gleaming black in the torchlight. The 2 survivors knelt with their hands empty, trembling as they awaited their fate. "Go," Bjorn commanded them. "Tell Kjell Irontooth and anyone else who would threaten innocent families what you witnessed here tonight. Tell them that some protections are sacred, and those who violate them face the consequences." The men scrambled away into the darkness, leaving Bjorn alone among the carnage. He stood motionless for long moments, his sword still in his hand, but his shoulders bearing the weight of what he had been forced to do. "Freyja," he called quietly, "it is finished. We must leave now." 1 year later, Freyja stood on the stone pier of Dublin harbour, watching the sunrise paint the Irish sea in shades of gold and amber. The morning was crisp with the promise of spring, and the familiar sounds of a working port, gulls crying, waves lapping against hulls, merchants haggling over prices, had become the soundtrack of her new life. Behind her, the workshop she shared with her father buzzed with activity. Eric had found his skills in high demand among the Irish lords, who valued Norwegian metalwork above all others. His reputation had grown quickly in this foreign land, earning him commissions that would have been impossible in their old village. Today, he was completing a ceremonial sword for the King of Leinster himself, the steel folded with techniques that made Irish smiths shake their heads in wonder. "The ship from Byzantium has docked," called a voice in accented Norse. Freyja turned to see young Padraig approaching, the Irish boy who served as their apprentice and translator. In the year since their arrival, he had become like a younger brother to her, eager to learn both smithing techniques and Norse customs. "Any passengers?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "Aye, one." A big man with scars on his face, asking for the Norwegian smith and his daughter. Bjorn had returned. He had been away for 3 months on a trading expedition to the Byzantine capital, serving as both guard and guide for a merchant convoy. The work paid well and used his knowledge of distant lands, but Freyja had counted each day of his absence. Their marriage had deepened from partnership to profound love, but his warrior's skills still called him to distant shores. She found him in the harbour's main square, his massive frame unmistakable even in the crowd of merchants and sailors. He was examining goods from the Byzantium voyage, silks and spices, ivory and rare gems, but his attention was clearly elsewhere. When he saw her approaching, his scarred face broke into the smile that never failed to make her heart race. "My lady wife," he said formally, then abandoned formality entirely to lift her in an embrace that drew amused glances from passers-by. "You are early," she said when he set her down. "The message said you would not return for another week." "The winds favored us," he replied, but she could see something more in his eyes: excitement, anticipation, the look of a man with important news to share. They walked together through the bustling streets of Dublin, past stone buildings that still amazed her with their permanence and grandeur. The Irish capital was unlike anything from her old life, larger, more prosperous, filled with people from a dozen different lands. Here, a Norwegian blacksmith's daughter could walk beside a famous warrior without drawing hostile stares. "Tell me about Byzantium," she said, as they made their way toward their home, a stone house with its own courtyard, purchased with gold earned from Eric's commissions and Bjorn's expeditions. "Magnificent and terrible in equal measure," he replied thoughtfully. "The emperor commands wealth beyond imagination, but his court breeds intrigue that makes Norwegian jarls seem like children playing at politics." They entered their courtyard, where Freyja had established a small garden that reminded her of home. Irish herbs grew alongside Norwegian flowers she had coaxed from seeds carried in their original flight. The blend of old and new had become a metaphor for their entire life. "There is news from Norway," Bjorn said as they settled on the bench beneath their apple tree. "The civil war continues, but Magnus the Good has gained the upper hand. He now calls himself King of all Norway. And our enemies? Kiel Iron-Tooth is dead, killed in a battle near Trondheim. Ingrid and her husband have lost most of their lands to Magnus's supporters. The old order we fled is crumbling." Freyja absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Part of her felt satisfaction that their tormentors had suffered, but another part mourned the destruction of the only home she had ever known. "Does this change anything for us?" she asked. Bjorn was quiet for a moment, considering his response. "Magnus has sent word through intermediaries. He would welcome my return, forgive my absence during the succession struggle. He offers lands, title, a position of honor in his court." The offer hung between them like a bridge to their past. Everything they had left behind could be reclaimed, their exile transformed into a triumphant homecoming. "What did you tell his messengers?" she asked quietly. "That I would consider his gracious offer," Bjorn replied, "and provide my answer within the year." "And what will that answer be?" He took her hands in his, just as he had that first night in the garden outside Jarl Magnus's hall. "What would you have it be?" Freyja looked around their courtyard, thinking of her father happily working on royal commissions, of young Padraig learning skills that would serve him all his life, of the freedom she had found to be herself without apology or explanation. "I think," she said slowly, "that some bridges are meant to be burned. We are not the same people who fled Norway in the night. We have built something here, not just wealth or reputation, but a life where we choose our own worth." Bjorn nodded, unsurprised by her response. "I hoped you would say that. Magnus offers me a place in his hierarchy, but here I have something better: partnership with my equals." As if summoned by their conversation, Eric emerged from the workshop, his face bright with satisfaction. Behind him came Padraig, carefully carrying the completed ceremonial sword. "Finished," Eric announced proudly. "The finest piece I have ever created." The weapon was indeed magnificent steel that seemed to glow with inner light. Silver inlay that traced Celtic patterns along the blade, a hilt wrapped in leather and gold wire. It represented the perfect fusion of Norwegian technique and Irish artistry, much like their new life itself. "Then we have cause for celebration," Bjorn declared. "Tonight we feast as free people in a land that values skill over birth, courage over compliance." As the sun set over Dublin harbour, painting the stone buildings in warm golden light, Freyja realized that her transformation was complete. She was no longer the invisible blacksmith's daughter who had hidden in shadows at wedding feasts. She was Freyja Bjornsdottir, wife to a legendary warrior, daughter to a master craftsman, creator of beauty in her own right. The silver arm ring that had started their partnership gleamed on Bjorn's wrist, catching the lamplight as he raised his cup in toast. But it was her iron pendant, the simple Thor's hammer she had forged with her own hands, that truly symbolized their journey. From humble iron, she had created something beautiful and lasting, just as they had done with their lives.